There's a common story we tell ourselves, often without even realizing it. A quiet lie whispered by the world, or maybe just by the gnawing fear in our own gut. It's the one that says if you just do more, if you just grab every single opportunity, stack every single brick, say yes to every single demand, then one day you'll finally have enough. Enough security, enough success, enough peace to just breathe. Most of us have been there. We see the mountain of work, the endless to-do lists, the countless ropes dangling, and we think the only way up is to try and climb every single one all at the same time. We pull and strain, our hands raw, our breath ragged, convinced that sheer volume of effort will eventually be our salvation. But what if all that pulling, all that frantic scrambling was actually holding us back? What if, in our desperate attempt to do everything, we were actually doing nothing well? What if the real secret to climbing higher, faster, wasn't about grabbing more ropes, but about picking the right one and truly learning how to master it? That's a lesson life usually teaches the hard way, with a few busted knuckles and a lot of lost sleep. That's the kind of lesson Eugene learned. He was a man, 48 years old, and a fixture on the assembly line at Consolidated Manufacturing just outside of town. His name was Eugene. You might not have noticed him in a crowd, not at first. He wasn't loud, didn't crack many jokes. He just was. A quiet, steady presence, dependable as the sunrise, which for Eugene often meant he was already on his way to work. He moved with the practiced, efficient motions of someone who'd spent half his life shaping metal and tightening bolts, his body a well-oiled machine in its own right, though perhaps a little rusty around the joints these days. You'd see it in his hands first, probably. Big, capable hands, the kind that looked like they could fix anything or build a house from scratch if he put his mind to it. They were scarred, crisscrossed with faint white lines from old cuts and burns, calloused thick from years of gripping tools and handling rough materials. They were the hands of a working man, no doubt about it. But if you look past the surface, past the smudges of grease and the ingrained dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove, you'd see a certain weariness etched into the very knuckles, a slight tremor sometimes when he was really tired. And his eyes, those were the real giveaway. Set in a face that was usually unsmiling but not unkind, his eyes were a tired shade of blue, often a little bloodshot from long hours. They held the weight of responsibility, the quiet burden of a man who knew what it meant to provide. Most days, they reflected the dull sheen of the fluorescent lights above the conveyor belt, reflecting the endless repetition of his work. But every now and then, especially when he thought no one was watching, you'd catch a flicker in them. A faint spark of something unextinguished, a ghost of a hope, or maybe just a quiet, stubborn resilience that refused to be completely snuffed out by the grind. It was the look of a man who kept showing up, kept trying, even when every fiber of his being screamed for rest. Eugene carried a quiet strength, sure, but he also carried the exhausting belief that his only path forward was to simply do more. Always more. Eugene was 48 years old, a solid, unremarkable figure on the assembly line, a cog in the vast, rumbling machine of the factory. He operated the stamping press, a loud, repetitive behemoth that shaped sheet metal into various components. He wasn't a supervisor, never pushed for it, too content with the predictable rhythm of the job, the familiar clang and hiss that filled his days. Folks at the plant, if they thought of Eugene at all, thought of him as steady. A man who showed up, did his work, didn't complain much, and always finished his quota. A reliable anchor in a sea of shifting priorities and younger, louder ambition. But underneath that quiet exterior, there was a constant hum of anxiety, a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep in his chest. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you jump, more like a slow, creeping dread. A fear of falling behind, of the world changing too fast and leaving him behind. A gnawing worry that no matter how hard he worked, how many extra shifts he clocked, the ground beneath his feet was slowly, imperceptibly eroding. His days started with the 5 a.m. alarm, a jarring intrusion into the deepest part of sleep, dragging him from the brief respite of unconsciousness. Before his feet even hit the cold linoleum, the familiar weight of the day settled on his shoulders. He'd shuffle to the kitchen, the faint smell of stale coffee from yesterday's pot clinging to the air, and make a fresh one, strong and black. Sarah, his wife, would usually be stirring then. Maybe Emily, their 16-year-old, would grunt a half-asleep greeting as she passed on her way to the bathroom, hair already a wild halo. Mark, the 12-year-old, was a human slug until the very last possible minute. Eugene cherished these quiet, almost silent mornings. A brief calm before the storm of the factory floor, before the clamor of family life, before the relentless march of responsibilities. The drive to the plant was short, the same route he'd taken for over 20 years, past the rows of modest houses that mirrored his own, past the diner with the flickering neon sign, then the sprawling gray concrete of the industrial park. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and effort. The stamping press was his domain. Clang his thump, a relentless, deafening ballet of brute force, hour after hour, feeding sheets of metal, watching them warp and reshape under immense pressure. His hands, gnarled and powerful, moved with an automatic precision that came from thousands of repetitions, each motion ingrained deep into his muscle memory. He was good at it, efficient, reliable. But it was a goodness that felt less like mastery and more like surrender. After the whistle blew, he'd trudge home, often stopping at the grocery store for whatever Sarah had texted him, the neon lights of the aisles a harsh contrast to the factory's dim glow. Dinner, homework questions, maybe a brief, tired conversation with Sarah about the kids or the leak under the sink. Then a few stolen hours of TV or, more often, a side project. Fixing a neighbor's leaky faucet for $50, tinkering with old lawnmowers he bought cheap to flip, anything to pad the meager monthly budget. Because the bills were always there, stacked neatly on the corner of the kitchen table, a silent, growing monument to their constant struggle. Mortgage, utilities, car insurance for the 17-year-old sedan, school trips, Emily's braces fund, Mark's new basketball shoes. It felt like he was running on a treadmill set to an ever-increasing speed, perpetually falling behind. Every dollar earned had a name attached to it before it even landed in his account. His house, while a home, was always in need of repair, a perpetually dripping faucet, a drafty window, paint peeling in the bathroom. He looked around and saw not comfort, but a never-ending list of chores, each one demanding time and money he didn't quite have. Inside, beneath the steady, uncomplaining exterior, a different kind of clang echoed. It was the sound of buried dreams, of paths not taken. There was a time long ago when Eugene had thought about becoming an auto mechanic, really getting his hands dirty in a way that felt like creation, not just repetition. He devoured books, spent weekends tinkering with his dad's old truck. He even toyed with the idea of photography, seeing the world through a lens, capturing moments instead of just enduring them. These were faint echoes now, ghosts of a younger man's ambitions, pushed aside by the pressing, immediate demands of a growing family and the perceived stability of the factory job. He harbored a quiet hope, a deep-seated wish for a simpler, more secure future for Sarah and the kids. Not wealth, just ease. A life where Sarah didn't have to fret over every grocery bill, where Emily could go to college without a mountain of debt, where Mark could chase whatever dream caught his eye without the shadow of financial constraint. But that hope was constantly at war with a quiet doubt, a persistent whisper that told him he wasn't smart enough, not ambitious enough, certainly not lucky enough to truly change things. He saw himself as a man who had to do everything, take on every task, because if he didn't, who would? He believed that sheer effort, raw, unadulterated sweat was the only currency he possessed. So he said yes to every extra shift, to every neighbor's request, to every extra layer of responsibility, spreading himself thinner and thinner until he felt like a transparent sheet of paper, always busy, always tired, never quite excelling, always running in place. The rhythm of his life was a relentless drumbeat. Up at 5, factory floor by 6, lunch pail in hand, every shift a dance with the same old machines. But for weeks, the rhythm had been off-kilter, strained by the extra hours he was piling on. Just this last push, he'd told Sarah, then we'll be ahead. Ahead of what he wasn't sure anymore, just ahead. Then came Emily's play. Dad, you promised. She'd said, her voice small but firm, just 2 weeks before opening night. I really want you there. It was a small role in some modern adaptation of a classic, but to Emily it was Broadway. Eugene had nodded, squeezed her hand. Wouldn't miss it for the world, Em. He truly meant it, but that Tuesday the world had other plans. Old man Henderson called in sick again. The line was backed up. Mr. Jenkins, the foreman, clapped Eugene on the shoulder, a heavy hand. Eugene, you're the only one I trust to finish this batch. We need you on the night shift, overtime and a half. Eugene's stomach churned. He thought of Emily's play, the curtain going up at 7. He thought of the extra cash, the furnace repair that couldn't wait. The two voices wrestled in his head, duty versus desire, responsibility versus promise. Duty won, as it always did. I'll be there, he'd rasped, the words tasting like ash. He called Sarah, the words stumbling out, hollow and rehearsed. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell her I'll make it up to her. Sarah's sigh on the other end was a heavy sound, thick with unspoken disappointment. He worked that double shift like a zombie, his body running on fumes and obligation. The noise of the machinery was a dull roar in his skull. Every bolt tightened, every lever pulled felt like a betrayal. When the whistle finally blew at 5 in the morning, his muscles screamed, his eyelids felt like lead weights, and his mind was a foggy mess. He dragged himself home, showered quickly, and collapsed into bed, telling himself he'd just rest for a few hours, then rush to the evening show. He set an alarm, or thought he did. He woke with a start, the room dark, a cold dread seizing his gut. He fumbled for his phone, 8:17 p.m. The play had started over an hour ago. He sprang out of bed, adrenaline pumping through his exhausted frame, a frantic, futile energy. No, 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 he muttered, pulling on clothes, his hands shaking. He drove like a maniac to the high school, the old sedan groaning in protest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The parking lot was full. He hurried inside, past the posters with crude drawings of characters, past the murmuring latecomers, and slipped into the auditorium. The air was thick with the scent of old carpet and nervous excitement. The house lights were down, the stage bathed in a single amber glow. He squinted, trying to find Sarah and Mark in the sea of shadowy figures. He found them in the third row, Sarah's back rigid, Mark fiddling with his program. And there on stage was Emily. Her face was painted, her hair pulled back, delivering a line with earnest, shaky conviction. His eyes found her after she finished her scene and retreated backstage, then emerged again for a group number. For a split second, her gaze swept over the audience, and for that sliver of time, it met his. He tried to offer a small, apologetic smile, a silent, "I'm here now." But the smile died on his lips. There was no anger in her eyes, no dramatics, just a quiet, profound disappointment. A flicker of hurt that was so deep, so pure, it felt like a knife twisting in his own chest. It wasn't the fury he deserved, but something far worse. The quiet knowledge that he'd let her down, not with a bang, but with a weary whimper. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just tired, he was absent. He was there, but he wasn't there. He barely remembered the drive home. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah was already in bed, the light under their door dark. Mark, he assumed, was asleep. But sleep wouldn't come for Eugene. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the numbers on the digital clock on his nightstand glowing an unforgiving red. 1:37 a.m., then 2:11 a.m., then 3:00 a.m. The house was utterly silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that amplified every doubt, every regret. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and padded silently to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, the cold liquid doing nothing to quench the fire burning in his gut. He sat at the kitchen table, the worn linoleum cool beneath his forearms, the darkness outside the window an inky black. This wasn't just about missing a play. This was about everything. He thought of the factory, the endless shifts, the dizzying array of tasks he'd volunteered for, always trying to prove his worth, always trying to get ahead. He thought of the side projects, the leaky faucet he'd promised to fix for Mrs. Gable down the street, the extra lawn he'd mowed for a few bucks, the vague, half-started ideas for saving money that only added more items to his endless mental to-do list. He saw a man constantly in motion, a blur of activity, yet if he stopped, really stopped and looked, he was precisely nowhere. What had his life become? A long, exhausting race against an invisible clock where the finish line kept moving. He was working harder than anyone he knew, but for what? A modest house he barely saw in daylight, a wife who looked tired too, and children whose milestones he was missing one after another. He was trying to be everything to everyone, and in doing so he was becoming nothing to himself and a fading presence to those who mattered most. The shame of Emily's quiet disappointment burned afresh. He wasn't building a better future. He was just building a bigger cage of his own making, filled with exhaustion and mediocrity. He was drowning in effort, and it wasn't getting him anywhere. He just kept paddling, believing that if he just paddled harder, faster, for longer, he would eventually reach shore. But all it was doing was making him more tired, more absent, and more adrift. The promise to Emily had been a quiet thing made weeks ago over cereal. "Dad, will you definitely come to my play? It's my biggest part yet." He'd seen the hopeful spark in her eyes, nodded, and instantly forgotten the precise date, burying it under a landslide of other commitments. Then a few days before, Sarah had reminded him, a gentle nudge. "Eugene, Emily's play is Thursday. No double shift, right?" He'd promised again, but Thursday came and with it a phone call from the foreman, a plea for an extra few hours. A crucial part needed machining, a deadline looming. "Just a few more, Eugene," the foreman had said. "You're the only one who can handle it right now." He'd heard the unspoken, indispensable. In the man's tone, felt the familiar surge of needing to be the hero, to show he was worth his salt, worth more than just the base pay. He'd swallowed the exhaustion already creeping into his bones and said yes. The hours stretched, each weld sparking, each heavy metal sheet grinding, blurring into the next. His back ached, his eyes stung from the fumes, and the rhythmic clang of the machinery had become a dull, relentless throb inside his skull. He kept glancing at the clock, thinking just a little more, just a little more. The play started at 7, 6:30, 7, 7:15, each minute a hammer blow. He rushed the last few steps, wiping grease from his hands with a ragged shop rag, fumbling with his wallet to punch out, his mind a frantic scramble of calculations. He'd barely make it if he floored it. He drove like a madman, the old pickup rattling, the speedometer needle quivering past the limit. Parked crookedly, ran through the school doors, the muffled sound of applause already reaching him. The hallway was empty, the auditorium doors closed. He pushed one open, slipping inside, trying to be invisible in the back row. On stage, a group of teenagers were taking their bows. The final scene just ended. And there she was, Emily, a delicate flower in a borrowed costume, her face glowing with the post-performance rush. Then her eyes scanned the crowd, searching, landing on him in the dim light of the back row. The smile, the vibrant joy faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But he saw it, the hope draining, replaced by a quiet, devastating understanding. A small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin, a quiet resignation. She offered a quick, forced smile in his direction, then turned to accept a bouquet from another parent, her shoulders slightly slumped. It wasn't a shout, not a tear-filled outburst. It was worse. It was the silence of a promise broken, the quiet acceptance of an absence she'd come to expect. It wasn't just missing the play, it was missing her. He felt it deep in his gut, a cold, heavy stone settling there, heavier than any metal part he'd lifted all day. He had traded her joy, her moment, for a few extra bucks, for a fleeting, meaningless pat on the back from a foreman who'd already forgotten his name. He was a ghost in his own life, a shadow flitting through the moments that truly mattered. That night the house was quiet, a familiar silence that usually settled around him like a worn blanket. But tonight it was a shroud. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Mark was tucked away, probably dreaming of video games. Emily, he imagined, was replaying her lines, the disappointment now an old, unwelcome friend in her thoughts. He couldn't sleep. 3 a.m., the hour when the world feels most alone, when thoughts echo loudest in the skull. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and padded silently to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under his bare feet. He didn't turn on the light, just sat at the table, staring out the window at the inky blackness, a faint smudge of street lamp glow barely visible through the grime on the glass. The image of Emily's face, that split-second shift from joy to quiet disappointment, replayed itself over and over. It was a loop, a brand on his soul. He'd seen it before in smaller ways. Mark's school project he'd promised to help with, only to nod off at the table. Sarah's anniversary dinner, rushed and silent because he'd had a particularly demanding week and couldn't muster the energy for conversation. What was he doing? He was working himself to death, chasing a phantom of security, believing that more effort, more hours, more doing would eventually lead to something. But what it was leading to was a life he barely recognized, a hollowed-out existence where he was present only in body, if even that. He was perpetually tired, constantly behind, never truly excellent at anything because his attention was fractured into a million tiny pieces. He wasn't climbing, he was thrashing in quicksand. Every extra shift, every side job, every attempt to be indispensable was just another handful of sand poured onto his head. He had believed he was building a fortress for his family, a shield against the world's uncertainties. Instead, he was building walls around himself, cutting himself off from the very people he was trying to protect. The raw, ugly truth settled in. He was a good man, he knew that much. He loved his family fiercely. But his method, his unwavering belief that sheer volume of effort was the answer, was not only failing him, it was failing them. He wasn't providing security, he was providing exhaustion, absence, and a vague, persistent mediocrity. A tremor ran through him, a cold dread. He couldn't keep doing this. He just couldn't. It wasn't working. It never had. He just couldn't. It wasn't working. It never had. The words echoed in the hollow chamber of his skull, a stark, unwelcome truth. The silence in the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to amplify it. Not working. Eugene wasn't a man for grand pronouncements or sudden epiphanies. His life was built on steady, incremental effort. But tonight, the accumulation of all those efforts had led him here, to this quiet, desperate realization. He felt an unfamiliar stiffness in his shoulders, a rigidity in his jaw. It wasn't anger, not really. It was a weariness so profound it had become physical, like every cell in his body was sighing in unison. He finally stood, the old linoleum cold under his bare feet. He walked to the window, pulled back the thin curtain. Outside, the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows of bare trees. Everything looked muted, colorless, like his life. A quiet "enough" formed in his mind, not a defiant shout, not a breakthrough of newfound strength. More like the last, ragged breath after a long, pointless sprint. Enough. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a strategy or a roadmap or a bold new vision. All he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, was that the way he'd been doing things, the relentless pursuit of more, had to stop. It was a slow, painful drowning, and he was finally ready to let go of the 1,000 ropes he'd been trying to hold onto. The alarm shrieked at 5 a.m. the next morning, just like every other weekday. For a split second, the familiar dread washed over him. He was tired. His body ached. But something was different. The dull ache in his chest, the one that usually signaled another day of just getting through it, felt sharper, defined. It was the ache of a choice made, not just another obligation endured. He went through the motions of getting ready. Lukewarm shower, stale coffee, toast eaten standing up. His lunch pail was packed. Sarah did that, bless her, and he picked up his keys, the weight of them familiar in his calloused hand. Factory life waited. Another 10 hours of noise, sweat, and endless repetition. The morning at the plant felt heavier than usual. The clatter of the presses, the whine of the conveyors, it all seemed to mock his quiet resolution. Eugene was on the assembly line, fitting components onto engine blocks, his movements precise, automatic. Around him, the usual hum of conversations faded in and out of his awareness. Old man Peterson was complaining about his back. Young Mike was showing off pictures of his new truck. Eugene just worked faster now, trying to make up for the internal battle that had kept him distracted. It was mid-afternoon when Frank, the line supervisor, walked up, clipboard in hand. Frank was a decent enough guy, but always had a new opportunity for someone to pick up extra slack. "Hey, Eugene," Frank said, his voice cutting through the din. "Friday afternoon, the new rapid response order came in. Need a couple of hands for the secondary inspection bay. Overtime, good money. You usually volunteer for that stuff, right?" The old Eugene, the one who believed every extra hour, every extra task was a step towards security, would have instinctively said yes. His mouth was already forming the word. His mind, however, flashed to Emily's face, to the hollow feeling in his gut, to the quiet enough from the night before. This rapid response was usually a rushed, disorganized mess, demanding frantic speed over careful quality, and often meant staying an hour or two later than scheduled to clean up the inevitable mistakes. It was more doing, not better. He hesitated. The silence stretched just a fraction of a second too long. Frank's eyebrows lifted. Frank." Eugene began, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "Appreciate the offer, but not today. I'm gonna focus on getting my line output for the afternoon run perfect. Been working on a couple of efficiency tweaks." He surprised himself with the second part. It just came out. He actually had been thinking about it in the back of his mind. A way to shave a few seconds off his component fitting without sacrificing quality. Frank blinked. "Efficiency tweaks." "All right, Eugene, whatever you say." He sounded surprised, a hint of curiosity in his tone, then just shrugged and moved on to the next worker. A strange sensation bloomed in Eugene's chest. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was a mixture of fear, had he just jeopardized his standing. And something else, something small but potent, a sense of agency. He had said no. He had chosen. His hands, still moving automatically, felt lighter. He watched Frank walk away, then looked down at the engine block. "Efficiency tweaks," he'd said. "All right then, time to make good on that." He spent the next hour not just going through the motions, but observing his own movements, the rhythm of the line. He noticed a slight reach, a micro-pause. Could he pre-stage the next part slightly differently? Could he adjust his grip on the tool to make the rotation smoother? It was small, infinitesimally small. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just doing. He was thinking about how he was doing and if he could do it better. The focus was intense, narrowing his world to just the component, his hands, and the subtle dance of efficiency. The noise of the factory faded into the background. For a brief, strange moment, he felt present. And in that presence, there was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. control. That feeling, that strange, quiet control, lasted through the rest of the shift. He didn't revolutionize the assembly line, didn't suddenly become a master craftsman overnight. What he did was pay attention. He minimized wasted motion. He made sure each part was perfectly aligned before the next step. He found himself slowing down, paradoxically, to move faster or at least smoother. He left the factory that day tired, sure, but it was a different kind of tired. Less like a beaten dog, more like a man who'd run a good race. The next morning, the siren call of his old habits was immediate. The 5 a.m. alarm screamed its usual demands. His body ached for the extra 30 minutes of sleep. The thought of just getting through the day, of just doing what he always did, felt like a warm, tempting blanket. Efficiency tweaks, he muttered to himself, the words feeling thin and foolish in the cold, pre-dawn air. He wanted to pull the covers over his head, to forget the promise he'd made to himself, to his daughter's disappointed eyes. But he didn't. He swung his legs out of bed, the floor cold under his feet. He made coffee, ate his toast, drove to work. Day 2, he stepped onto the floor, and the sheer volume of noise, the relentless pace, immediately started to chip away at that fragile sense of newness. His old buddy, Mike, clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you're suddenly a lean manufacturing guru, Eugene." Mike chuckled, not unkindly, but with that familiar factory cynicism that had a way of flattening any grand ideas. Eugene just grunted, forced a weak smile. He found himself trying to implement his tweaks on the line, only to fall back into old patterns under pressure. His hands, conditioned by decades of rote repetition, wanted to rush, to grab the next part before the current one was fully seated, to reach awkwardly just to save a step. He felt the familiar knot of stress tightening in his gut, the urge to just do more, faster, even if it meant sloppiness. He caught himself, knuckles white around a wrench, breathing hard, then forced himself to reset. Slow down, focus. He remembered Emily's face. He remembered the feeling of being utterly lost in the chaos of his own making. No, not again. By the end of that first week, the battle was constant. At home, Sarah asked him to fix a leaky faucet and then mentioned the sagging fence needing repair. The old Eugene would have immediately agreed to both, adding them to his endless mental list of chores, stressing over when he'd find the time. But this time, he paused. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and then at Mark, who was trying to show him a drawing. "Tell you what," he said, surprising himself. "Let me tackle the faucet tomorrow after work, properly. Then we can look at the fence next weekend. Maybe Mark can help me." Sarah blinked. "Just the faucet?" she asked, a faint surprise in her voice. He nodded. "Just the faucet, and right now I'm looking at Mark's drawing." The guilt was there, a dull ache that he was somehow shirking his duty, not being the man who did everything. But when Mark's face lit up and he launched into an excited explanation of his rocket ship, the ache lessened. He was doing this well. For this moment, he was present. The following week on the factory floor, the fatigue settled in deeper. The initial spark had dwindled to a stubborn ember. There were days he questioned everything. What was the point? He was still Eugene, punching the clock. His muscles still screamed, the line still moved at its relentless pace. He wasn't suddenly making more money or getting promoted. He slipped up more than once, letting an old habit take over, rushing a component, then feeling that familiar pang of mediocre quality. "See," a voice inside him sneered. "You can't change. You're just a cog, Eugene. Always have been. Just go back to doing everything, at least then you feel like you're trying." He almost gave in. Almost told Frank he'd take that extra Saturday shift Frank had mentioned. Almost plunged back into the comfortable, suffocating blanket of overcommitment. One particularly brutal Tuesday, after a night of poor sleep, he found himself staring blankly at an engine block, his hands moving mechanically, mind miles away. He missed a small inspection point, nearly sending a faulty part down the line. A cold sweat broke out. He caught it just in time, pulled it back, and corrected it, his heart hammering. That was it. That was the slip. The consequence of his mind wandering, of letting the old patterns reassert themselves. The shame was sharp, but beneath it, a renewed resolve hardened. He wouldn't just try to do less. He had to do what he was doing with an unforgiving focus. It wasn't about avoiding work. It was about honoring the work he chose to do and honoring the people he did it for. He closed his eyes for a split second, then opened them, fixing his gaze on the next component. This was the battle, not against the factory, but against himself. And he was not going to lose it, not for Emily, not for Sarah, not for that quiet hope inside him that whispered of a different way. He took a deep, deliberate breath and started again. The days that followed were a grind, not just of steel and grease, but of will. Eugene felt like he was constantly pushing against an invisible current, the inertia of years of habit, the subtle tug of expectation from a world that knew him as the guy who always says yes. Day 3, the foreman, Mr. Henderson, clapped him on the shoulder. "Eugene, good man. We got a snag on the beeline. That old hydraulic press is acting up again." Frank scratching his head. "You got a minute." Old Eugene would have already been halfway there, wrench in hand, a silent nod his only reply. But new Eugene paused. He was meticulously calibrating a new set of tooling for his own section, a job that required absolute precision, and he'd realized a fresh eye. He'd volunteered for it last week, choosing it specifically because it was challenging and directly related to improving his output quality. He looked at Henderson, then at his work, then back at Henderson, forcing himself to breathe deep before he spoke. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm deep in this calibration right now. Frank's a good man, he'll figure it out. And if he can't, maybe we bring in the specialist. My focus needs to be right here to get this done right." The words felt like gravel in his throat. Henderson raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Right. Well, all right then, Eugene. You heard the man, Frank." He walked off a little quicker than usual. Eugene's stomach tightened. He felt a moment of raw guilt, a visceral urge to shout, I'll go! But he gripped his wrench, forcing his gaze back to the intricate gauges he had chosen, and now he had to stand by that choice. He finished the calibration a full hour ahead of schedule with a precision he knew was top-notch, something he'd never achieved when constantly interrupted. A week later, the novelty of his new approach had worn off, replaced by the relentless pull of old temptations. He was tired, a different kind of tired, now mentally drained from constant decision-making. At home, the old anxieties gnawed. The leaky tap in the bathroom, the creaking step on the porch, Emily's college fund. They all screamed for his scattered attention. He found himself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. again, not with despair, but with a fresh wave of self-doubt. Was he being selfish? Was this, doing less, just a fancy excuse for slacking off? He'd always believed that every spare minute had to be monetized, every problem tackled immediately, no matter how crudely. He remembered the stack of overdue bills on the kitchen counter, the ones he'd usually try to offset with a weekend odd job. The thought of picking up extra hours at the factory just to get ahead was a siren song. It was familiar. It was easier. He could almost feel the phantom ache of the extra shifts in his shoulders, a perverse comfort. But then he saw Emily's face in his mind's eye, that look of disappointment. He heard Sarah's soft voice. "You look worn out, honey." He thought of the half-built birdhouse in the garage for Mark, a project he'd promised weeks ago but kept putting off because he was too busy doing everything else. "No," he whispered into the dark room. "This isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing something, one thing, and doing it well." The next day he walked past Frank, who was still muttering about the hydraulic press. "Morning, Eugene." Frank grumbled, a hint of something in his voice that sounded like a lingering complaint. Old Eugene would have stopped, asked if he needed a hand now. But new Eugene just nodded, a small, genuine smile, and kept walking towards his own workstation. He focused on his tasks, deliberately slowing down, checking and rechecking, looking for ways to streamline, not just rush through. He noticed a slight vibration in a bearing on his main assembly line that he'd usually have dismissed as normal wear and tear. He reported it. It was a minor thing, easily fixed, but it could have led to a major breakdown. A small win, but it felt monumental. By day 14, the internal battle was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his days. Some of his colleagues still looked at him sideways. Frank even made a joke about Eugene finding religion and becoming too good for overtime. It stung. Eugene was a man who valued being part of the team, pulling his weight. But he remembered the lesson. Trying to do everything means you ain't doing nothing well. He couldn't go back to that blurred, exhausted existence. He leaned into the quiet rhythm of his chosen tasks. He started taking his lunch break outside when the weather allowed, just 5 minutes of quiet, staring at the sky. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. He focused. He messed up sometimes, sure, but he didn't beat himself up anymore. Instead, he would pause, identify the exact point of error and correct it, learning from it rather than just powering through. He was still Eugene, tired, responsible Eugene, but there was a new stillness about him, a quiet strength that was slowly, painstakingly taking root. He was still fighting, but now he was fighting for something, not just against everything. By day 20, a different kind of quiet settled over Eugene. It wasn't the quiet of exhaustion or the quiet of resignation. It was the hum of focused effort. He found himself anticipating problems on the line before they became full-blown crises, a direct result of his unhurried attention to his specific domain. He wasn't just tightening bolts. He was feeling the machine, listening to its rhythm, almost like a mechanic with a finely tuned engine. One Tuesday, old Mr. Henderson, the line supervisor, a man who rarely offered more than a grunt of acknowledgement, stopped by Eugene's station. Eugene braced himself, expecting a complaint maybe about his refusal to pick up another shift. Instead, Henderson just watched him work for a long minute, his eyes tracking Eugene's precise movements as he adjusted a sensor. "That's twice this week you've caught a component before it went out of spec, Eugene," Henderson rumbled, his voice gravelly. "Saved us a whole afternoon of rework on the second shift." Eugene just nodded, a slight flush rising to his cheeks. He wasn't looking for praise, but it felt good, a warmth spreading through him that was different from the burning shame of the past. "Keep it up," Henderson added, then shuffled off. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that his deliberate choice to do less was starting to produce more in the eyes of the men who mattered. At home, the shift was even more profound. The house didn't feel like a pit stop anymore. He'd carved out an hour, 4 evenings a week, for specific projects. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, it was helping Mark with his science fair project, a simple model volcano that, under Eugene's focused guidance, became a meticulous, well-researched explosion of baking soda and vinegar. Mark, usually lost in his video games, was actually talking to his dad, his eyes wide with shared discovery. On Mondays and Wednesdays, he'd sit with Emily, not to quiz her on homework, but just to listen. He'd learn to ask about her day without judgment, without trying to fix everything. He'd simply be present. One night, she talked for almost an hour about a friendship drama at school, something he'd barely known existed before. When she finished, she looked at him, not with the old disappointment, but with a surprising gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," she'd said, a small, genuine smile. It actually helps just to talk it out. He hadn't offered a single solution, just listened. And in that quiet listening, he felt a connection he hadn't known he'd lost. The fear of falling behind, while still a whisper, was starting to be drowned out by the quiet confidence of making real progress in the places that truly counted. He was present. He was seeing his kids, not just passing through their lives. Weeks turned into a couple of months. Eugene was still Eugene, the same sturdy frame, the same practical clothes, the same early mornings. But his eyes were different. The deep-set shadows were still there, a testament to years of toil, but now there was a spark, a steady light. The flicker of quiet resilience had grown into a calm, steady flame. At the factory, his reputation solidified. He wasn't the man who'd jump on every shift, but he was the man you went to when a specific part of the line was acting up. He knew that section inside and out, not just how to keep it running, but how to make it run better. He'd even suggested a small modification to a tension spring assembly, a simple tweak that increased throughput by a hair but significantly reduced wear and tear over time. Henderson had approved it, then gone one step further, asking Eugene to help train a couple of the younger guys on his methods. Eugene, the quiet man, the one who used to just keep his head down, was now teaching. He wasn't overwhelmed anymore. He felt a strange kind of liberation in saying no to things that didn't fit in protecting his focus. It wasn't laziness, it was strategic. He'd cleared the clutter, and in the space he created, he found clarity. He was no longer running on fumes, chasing every fleeting demand. He was building. He was perfecting. At home, the difference was like night and day. Sarah noticed it first, not just his presence, but the quality of his presence. He wasn't just physically there. His mind was there too. They started having real conversations over dinner again, not just coordinating schedules. He found time to fix the leaky faucet he'd been meaning to get to for a year, not just patch it, but replace the whole assembly properly. He even started a small vegetable patch in the backyard with Mark, a long-forgotten dream, tending it with the same focused care he gave his assembly line. The first tiny sprouts pushing through the earth felt like a metaphor for his own life, small, intentional growth blooming from neglected ground. He was still a factory worker, still lived in his modest house, still faced bills. But the constant, gnawing anxiety had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, not by doing more, but by being truly excellent at what he chose to do. He wasn't overwhelmed anymore. He felt a strange kind of liberation in saying no to things that didn't fit in protecting his focus. It wasn't laziness, it was strategic. He'd cleared the clutter, and in the space he created, he found clarity. He was no longer running on fumes, chasing every fleeting demand. He was building, he was perfecting. At home, the difference was like night and day. Sarah noticed it first, not just his presence, but the quality of his presence. He wasn't just physically there. His mind was there too. They started having real conversations over dinner again, not just coordinating schedules. He found time to fix the leaky faucet he'd been meaning to get to for a year, not just patch it, but replace the whole assembly properly. He even started a small vegetable patch in the backyard with Mark, a long-forgotten dream, tending it with the same focused care he gave his assembly line. The first tiny sprouts pushing through the earth felt like a metaphor for his own life, small, intentional growth blooming from neglected ground. He was still a factory worker, still lived in his modest house, still faced bills. But the constant, gnawing anxiety had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving, not by doing more, but by being truly excellent at what he chose to do. One afternoon, during a break, he found himself sitting beside Mike, one of the younger guys he was training. Mike, barely out of trade school, was slumped against a stack of pallets, his face etched with the same kind of weariness Eugene knew all too well. Mike was the new Eugene, trying to do everything, volunteer for every overtime shift, fix every small problem that cropped up. He was always running, always trying to impress, always looking frayed at the edges. "Rough day, Mike?" Eugene asked, his voice low. Mike just grunted. "Every day's rough, Eugene. Feels like I'm running on a treadmill, barely keeping up, but I gotta get ahead, gotta prove myself." He ran a hand through his greasy hair. "My foreman's got me on 3 different lines today, trying to cover for guys on sick leave, then they want me to help with inventory after shift. I'm gonna screw something up, I just know it." Eugene nodded, remembering the echo of his own desperation. "I used to think that way," he said slowly, picking up a stray washer and turning it in his fingers. "Thought if I just grabbed every single rope, tried to pull myself up, I'd get somewhere. Tried to be indispensable by being everywhere, doing everything." He looked at Mike, his eyes steady. "But all that grabbing, it just meant I was flailing. Barely holding on, spread so thin I wasn't doing anything well." Mike looked at him, surprised. Eugene wasn't one for long speeches. "So what changed?" he asked. "I learned to choose," Eugene replied. "Sounds simple, don't it? But it's the hardest damn thing, learning to say no to the extra ropes no matter how shiny they look. Picked one, maybe 2, the strongest ones, the ones that really mattered for me and my work here. And then I stopped flailing and I started climbing." He gestured vaguely towards the assembly line they worked on. "Focused on mastering this, making it run smoother, faster, with fewer mistakes. The stuff they actually pay me to do and do it damn well. The rest, if it didn't fit, I let it go." Mike frowned. "But you don't fall behind." Eugene chuckled softly. "Funny thing is, you actually go faster. You ain't wasting energy on all the other ropes. You get good at the main climb and suddenly the other stuff, the stuff you have to do, it gets easier. You find a rhythm. You got energy left for home, for what really matters." He looked directly at Mike. "Trying to do everything means you ain't doing nothing well. You're just busy, and busy ain't the same as productive." Mike sat there, processing it, the noise of the factory floor a distant hum. Eugene didn't wait for a reply. He'd said his piece. He'd lived it. Weeks turned into months. Eugene continued his quiet revolution. Emily got into her chosen college, largely thanks to the steady, present support of a father who was no longer just a shadow passing through. Mark's garden patch flourished, a testament to focused, consistent effort. Sarah smiled more. And at work, Eugene's efficiency numbers continued to climb, his advice sought out, his presence a calm, reliable force. He used to think you had to grab every single rope just to stay afloat. Turns out if you pick the strongest rope and really learn how to climb it, you go a lot higher, a lot faster. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? We all got ropes to climb, burdens to carry. And most of us, we try to grab every single one, thinking that's how you get ahead, that's how you prove yourself. But sometimes, oftentimes, the real secret isn't in how much you're doing, but in how much you're choosing.